Well, experts have warned of dire economic consequences as the trade war between world superpowers, the US and China, intensifies. Countries across the world could feel the repercussions. Director at the Political Economy Southern Africa, Sia Piniza, joins us now to unpack the story. Sia, just giving us a brief trade background on this war that's happening currently.
Sure. So the actual trade war started, I think, in March this year, after the U.S. Secretary of Commerce delivered a report to President Donald Trump regarding aluminium and steel imports into the U.S., claiming that the levels of current imports are high and that they pose a national security threat. Donald Trump then signed a proclamation to assign tariffs to both aluminium and steel imports, and at the time was in negotiations with Argentina, Brazil, and Australia, which are amongst some of its biggest sources of aluminium and steel globally. And at April this year, Donald Trump then reached an agreement with these countries and added them to the list of countries that are exempted from this tariff. But South Africa still remains affected by the tariff, despite our appeals to the U.S. government through the ambassador and through Minister Rob Davies in terms of written and as well as verbal submissions to the U.S. government through the trade representative and the deputy trade representative. South Africa remains on the countries that are affected by the tariff.
The DTI has already said, South Africa's steel industry is too small to even feel the effects of this, but other sectors might, feel the pinch of this trade war that's happening currently. Which are those?
Yeah, so I think the biggest sector that will be affected is our manufacturing sector, particularly around home appliances such as fridges, washing machines, etc. A lot of the products that are exported to the US are from these groups, as well as our transporting sector. Export of cars as well as catalytic converters will be the most affected. Although South Africa's exports to the US in terms of steel and aluminium are relatively small, the value chain of these two commodities expands very wide and broad, from household appliances as mentioned all the way to catalytic converters and automobile parts. And these will be the jobs and exports that are most affected by this tariff. Although South Africa has estimated that the tariff will affect around 7,500 jobs in the sector, this is an underestimate of the actual impact.
We've seen how stern the US has been in terms of all these tariffs, choosing to be protectionist, if one can put it that way. But what happens when China responds, because they're one of the biggest consumers in the world?
Yes. Look, the challenge there is that the Chinese government responding will also have a negative impact on US firms that are operating out of China, exporting into the, as a result of Trump's action, the US firms operating in China and exporting into the US will be affected, but a retaliatory action doesn't seem to have as a direct impact on the US, given that the US exports in the Chinese market are relatively small. The biggest items that are being targeted are, of course, automobiles, given that Trump is now considering increasing imported car tariffs by an additional 25%. Currently, they're sitting at around 15 to 5%, but they've had a specific dispensation when it comes to China and targeting at increasing that tariff to 40%. And the Chinese government has vowed to retaliate. And, the big issue here is the centrality of the balance of trade. The idea is that these countries trade with one another, but the balance of trade benefits China more, given that China has a trade surplus, meaning that it exports to the US more than it imports from the US. So ultimately, what Donald Trump is trying to do is to see that trade surplus reduced as a result of increasing cost of Chinese imports to its US consumers. And the idea is that they would then consume less of the Chinese goods, reducing the quantum or the size of imports that the US imports from China. But, you know, China being such a huge and significant production hub globally, I doubt that we're at that stage where this has actually come to an end, and I doubt that it will have the desired impact, at least in terms of stimulating domestic aluminium and steel products and exports from the US. Because obviously the world is now much more integrated, and you know the impact as highlighted will also affect US firms in China who are exporting to the US. Much as it will affect Chinese firms who are trying to export to the US. And so it is a bit of a double-edged sword.
And of course, the African continent can't just sit and watch. Of course, both these superpowers trading within the continent. So how does the likes of South Africa, Kenya, and all other economic powers in the African continent respond to this?
Yeah, so already we've seen that Minister Davies has said that he's considering some retaliatory action. But the challenge with this is that African economies are given preferential access to the US economy as a result of the legislation that Obama put into place, the AGOA Act, which is the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act, which provides preferential access for African exports into the US market. And what might be at jeopardy as a result of this war in terms of tariffs might be South Africa's access through AGOA. You might remember that a few years back, this was also at jeopardy as a result of the tariffs that we placed on poultry imports from the rest of the world. And the US took a very strong stance and negotiated quite heavy-handedly in its favor, which resulted in South Africa reducing its import tariffs on poultry and increasing some of its quotas with regards to poultry imports from the US in exchange for retained access through the AGOA agreement. And so African countries have got limited space in terms of retaliating through the tariffs. Okay. But this does create an opportunity for African countries to focus much more concertedly on intra-Africa trade and trading with one another and moving away from the model of the past that relied heavily on exporting to the US and Europe and moving towards intra-Africa and perhaps even Southeast Asian export markets.
All right, thank you very much. That was the director at PESA, Sia Biniza.